By far, the most dangerous of those foods is sugar. And the reason why it's so dangerous is because if you look out in nature, you're gonna find a sugar tree, a sugar bush, sugar branch. It just doesn't exist. And so we have to pull it out of something. We have to pull sugars out of beets. We have to pull it out of cane. Or we manufacture it and call it high-fructose corn syrup. And so what happens is our body's primary fuel is sugar, but what we're putting in our body is not the way that our body was designed to receive sugar. When you look at it inside of fruits, for instance, fruits have fiber attached to sugar. So what happens when you eat it, the sugar is being released slowly, which is healthy for you. It gives the insulin time to come grab it up, take it to the muscle and say, hey, you go inside of there, give the muscle some energy. But when you don't have that fiber there, it's like literally taking wads of money and like throwing it out in the blood. And the insulin is like, I don't know what to do with it. So that's why diabetes is so prevalent.
Fatty liver, how can you recover from fatty liver? It's very easy. Remember the sustain me principle? A is abstain, stop the foods that are sweetened with the high fructose corn syrup. And you see, people look at the label and say, high fructose, oh, sounds like fruit. Corn, oh, corn's good. Can you see that wording? The person almost thinks it's good. It's like monosodium glutamate called natural flavor enhancer. People read it and said, oh, natural, well, that's good. Flavor, oh, yeah, we like flavor. Mate. Can you see the wording? Often the wording, there's little tricks in those wording. Because if you just say chemicals have sweetened this, oh, we're not going to touch that. So it's that trick in wording. So that's your fatty liver. To recover from fatty liver, get the carbohydrate levels right down, eliminate anything that's sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. Start drinking water, stop drinking fruit juice. And within a couple of weeks, fatty liver can be resolved.
For decades, a hidden ingredient has been quietly destroying our health, slipping into almost everything we eat and drink. We are talking about high-fructose corn syrup, HFCS, a cheap and deceptively sweet additive that has infiltrated our food supply under the radar, fueling a public health crisis that's too big to ignore. But how did this happen? Why wasn't anyone warned? In this eye-opening investigation, Dr. Bobby Price and Barbara O'Neill pull back the curtain on one of the food industry's darkest secrets. They'll reveal how this ingredient became a staple in everything from sodas to bread, why its dangers were deliberately concealed, and the shocking toll it's taking on our bodies today. If you've ever wondered why rates of obesity, diabetes, and chronic illness are skyrocketing, or if you've unknowingly fallen victim to this sweet deception, stay tuned. This is the exposé the food industry never wanted you to see. Think about the last snack you had, or the drink you sipped on. Was it water, milk, fruit, or veggies? If not, there's a good chance it had something called high-fructose corn syrup, or HFCS for short. But what's the deal with this sweet stuff? Let me break it down. HFCS is a sweetener made from corn, kind of like that sugar you'd stir into your coffee or lemonade. But instead of you doing the stirring, food companies mix it into tons of processed foods and drinks to make them taste just right. The story of HFCS goes back to 1957, when two scientists, Richard O. Marshall and Earl R. Couey, came up with a way to make it. They used an enzyme called glucose isomerase to transform plain old glucose in corn syrup into fructose. Fast forward to the 1970s, HFCS was popping up in sodas, snacks, and just about every processed food you can think of. Here's how it's made. It all starts with corn. First, they mill it to get the starch out, then add some acid and special enzymes like alpha amylase and glucoamylase. These enzymes break the starch down into glucose. After that, they use another enzyme, xylose isomerase, to turn some of that glucose into fructose. Once that's done, they clean it up and tweak the levels to get HFCS, which you'll find in your favorite soft drinks. There are two main types, HFCS 42, 42% fructose, used in things like breakfast cereals and processed foods, and HFCS 55, 55% fructose, the go-to for sodas.
Have you heard of high fructose corn syrup? People see high fructose corn syrup and they think, well, that sounds healthy. Fructose, fruit, syrup, oh, that sounds all right. But it's one of the most dangerous sweeteners there are. It's so cheap. That's why they use it.
Basically, in the early 70s, the world had a sugar crisis. Sugar prices were sky high because bad weather ruined crops in places like Europe and the Soviet Union, which had to start importing sugar. Even countries that usually exported sugar, like the Philippines and Peru, stopped so they could keep enough for themselves. But US farmers had a ton of corn, thanks to years of government subsidies. So, scientists figured out how to make HFCS from all that corn. And by 1975, it had replaced traditional sugar in soft drinks because it was so much cheaper. Between 1970 and 1990, HFCS use exploded. It went up by 1,000%. Since HFCS was so affordable, food companies could cut costs and sell their products at lower prices. Pretty soon, it was everywhere. Bread, cookies, ketchup, salad dressings, sodas, you name it. By the late 90s and early 2000s, most processed foods in the US had some HFCS in them. The big shift started with sodas. Around the early 1980s, giants like Coca-Cola and Pepsi swapped out sugar for HFCS in their drinks because it saved them a ton of money, and the flavor difference was barely noticeable to the average person. From there, it became like the food industry's best-kept secret. The sneaky part? Companies didn't shout about the switch. They used vague language like natural flavors or just listed corn syrup on labels, knowing most people wouldn't think twice. Back then, no one really knew what HFCS was, let alone questioned if it was good for you. All people saw were sweeter, cheaper foods, so they kept buying. But the funny part is,
A slice of white bread will get the blood sugar level up higher and quicker than a candy. So your baseline with glycemic index would be 55. So anything below 55 is considered low GI. So that's good food for diabetics. Anything above 55 is considered high. That means it goes into the blood, into glucose very quick. So let me give you something to compare. So cherries are about 26. So cherries are good for diabetics. Grapefruit, I think we all realise that would be fairly low, 25. So where does sugar sit? Whether it's white or tan or brown or black. Sugar sits at 59.
the glycemic index of HFCS is 87. Now, just think how dangerous it is. Fructose is naturally found in fruits and honey, but high-fructose corn syrup, HFCS, is quite different. When you consume a lot of fructose, it makes you crave more food and messes with your taste buds too. Back in 1986, people were eating about 56 grams of fructose a day, but by 2007, that number jumped to 65 grams. This increase has a lot to do with the growing obesity problem and the rise of insulin resistance. Now, what's weird about fructose is that it doesn't make you feel full the way glucose or regular sugar does, so you end up eating more, and your body stores that extra energy as fat, which naturally leads to obesity.
Another thing that consuming excess sugar or unnatural sugar in the form of high fructose corn syrup, maltodextrose, I can go on and on. Again, as I said before, I talk about this in my book. There's over 75 different names for the type of sugars that they're using in the food that they put in processed unnatural food that most people aren't aware of. But most important is that excess sugar is converted into fat. The same way it is in the liver, is converted into that fat in the body as well too. And so what I typically will notice with people when they're coming to me is that if I see somebody whose midsection of their body is very, very, heavy, okay? If the most of the weight is concentrated in the abdomen area, it tells me that they love carbs and sugar.
The World Health Organization pointed out that by 2014, nearly 40% of adults worldwide were overweight, with 500 million being obese. All this excess fructose not only messes with your waistline, but it also messes with your nutrients and can cause vitamin deficiencies. And there's strong evidence that fructose is linked to type 2 diabetes. A study of over 9,000 women showed that those who drank fructose-sweetened drinks daily doubled their risk of developing diabetes. This happens because fructose is processed differently by your body than glucose. Instead of giving you energy and making you feel full, it promotes fat storage. It doesn't trigger insulin or leptin, which are hormones that tell your body when to stop eating. So you're basically eating more and storing more fat. A 10-week study even showed that people who ate a lot of fructose ended up with more fat in their belly and even insulin resistance, and all of this happened even without gaining weight. But it gets worse. Eating too much fructose messes with your liver too. It boosts bad lipids, increases your triglycerides, the kind of fat that clogs up arteries, and makes your liver store even more fat. This long-term damage increases your risk of heart disease and a condition called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH, which is like a warning sign that your liver is starting to go bad because of all the fat it's holding on to. Over time, this can develop into more serious liver issues, like cirrhosis or even liver cancer. A study by Dr. Michael Caron at the University of California, San Diego, showed that mice fed a high-fructose diet developed fatty livers and even liver tumors.
What causes fatty liver? Interesting question. It's fructose. When fruit breaks down, it breaks down to glucose and fructose. Sugar is half fructose and glucose. So a lot of fruit juices, they got high fructose and they got sugar in them, which is another fructose and glucose. And a lot of cakes, biscuits, croissants, donuts, things like that, they're sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. Have you heard of high fructose corn syrup?
The high-fructose diet also caused the gut barrier to break down, which allowed toxins and bacteria to sneak into the bloodstream and inflame the liver.
The next thing is cognitive decline, having some, mental effects as a result of sugar too. It will affect your ability to concentrate. So a lot of people who have an ability to concentrate, who believe that they have ADD or ADHD, it could be because you're consuming too much sugar.
But here's the good part. When researchers fixed the gut barrier in the mice, it stopped the fat from building up in their liver, which could open the door for new treatments to prevent liver damage caused by fructose. This study is a big deal, especially since fatty liver disease is becoming more common in the US. But is the food industry being cautious about using HFCS because of this? Hell no. For years, the food industry worked hard to downplay just how harmful high-fructose corn syrup really is. Even though more and more evidence was coming out about how it contributed to things like obesity, diabetes, and liver disease, the industry kept pushing the idea that it was just another harmless sweetener. How did they do this? They funded a ton of studies that made it look like HFCS wasn't as bad as people thought. These studies often twisted the facts or only highlighted certain parts of the research, leaving out the dangers. Basically, they used their money to make sure the public kept buying into the idea that HFCS was safe. On top of that, the food industry spent a lot of time and money on lobbying. They made sure government bodies like the FDA and the CDC didn't push for clear labeling or any kind of regulation that might make people think twice. If there was talk about putting a tax on sugary drinks or limiting certain foods, the industry would step in and argue that it wasn't necessary or that it was too extreme. As the obesity crisis started to take off in the 90s and early 2000s, HFCS became a big target. But instead of acknowledging the growing evidence that it was causing health problems, the food industry pushed the narrative that it wasn't any worse than other sugars and blamed obesity on things like people not exercising enough. But imagine this. You're grabbing a soda or some sweet treat, not thinking much about what's inside. Most of those sugary foods have high fructose corn syrup. And here's how it works. When you eat something with HFCS, your liver gets hit with a huge load of fructose. Unlike glucose, which is spread out and processed throughout your body, fructose is mostly dealt with in the liver. But your liver can only handle so much. And when it's overwhelmed by all this fructose, it starts making extra fat, specifically triglycerides. These fats float around in your blood and mess with insulin, the hormone that helps regulate sugar. The more insulin your body has to produce to deal with sugar, the more your cells become resistant to it, and eventually your body can't keep up. That's when insulin resistance sets in, and it's a big factor in why so many people develop type 2 diabetes. Now, if you keep this up for years, as we have already been doing, things get even worse. Chronic HFCS consumption leads to inflammation in the body, which can hurt your blood vessels and increase your risk of heart disease. This inflammation, combined with all that extra fat, can eventually lead to atherosclerosis, when plaque builds up in your arteries, blocking blood flow. So, you see, it's not at all a lack of proper exercise problem. Dr. Bobby Price and Barbara O'Neill have both spent a lot of time raising awareness about the dangers of high-fructose corn syrup, HFCS, something that's found in so many of the processed foods we eat today. They're not just doctors. They're passionate about teaching people how HFCS messes with our health. Both of them have warned us about how this stuff can lead to obesity, insulin resistance, and all sorts of other problems like diabetes and liver damage. Naturopathic Dr. Bobby Price is all about whole, natural foods and wants people to stop using sweeteners like HFCS that wreck our bodies. Instead, he recommends more natural options like honey or maple syrup, which are easier on the body. Similarly, Barbara O'Neill, who's known internationally for her work in natural health, shares the same perspective. She teaches that the body just doesn't know how to handle HFCS the way it does natural sugars found in fruits and vegetables. Her advice? Detox, stay hydrated, and stick to a whole food diet that's packed with nutrients. She doesn't buy into the mainstream health guidelines that promote processed sugars and pre-packaged food. Instead, she's always encouraging people to go back to basics, eating real, whole foods and avoiding all the junk. Together, these two have made it their mission to show us the truth about HFCS and the food industry's role in pushing us toward unhealthy diets. They're part of a growing movement that's all about returning to real, natural food choices, something that could save our health in the long run. But their movement is never as strong as the huge flash marketing of the food industries. There was a study by the New York Post which found that 82% of Americans think food labels are misleading. Even crazier, 93% of people feel like companies are sneaky with sugar, using all kinds of different names to hide it on labels. This is a huge issue, and it's all about something called scientific exploitation. Companies misuse scientific-sounding terms to make their products seem healthier than they really are. It's like a sneaky way of tricking people into thinking they're making good choices when they're really not. Take Canada, for example. They've had rules since 2002 that say food labels must list calories, key nutrients, and daily values. But the labels can be off by 20% when it comes to calorie counts. That means you could be eating way more than you think. Imagine you're trying to lose weight and picking low-calorie foods, thinking you're doing it right, only to find out the numbers were wrong all along. That's pretty messed up. And here's where it gets even trickier. You've probably seen labels that say all natural or no sugar added, right? Well, those labels aren't as trustworthy as they seem. The FDA defines natural as food without artificial ingredients, but it doesn't talk about how the food was made or processed. So, just because something says natural doesn't mean it's actually healthy. Same with no sugar added. A lot of those products still have loads of sugar, just in different forms. Take 100% juice, for example. No added sugar? Sure, but it's still packed with sugar. Then there's the issue with fruit-based products. Many snacks, like granola bars or fruit snacks, are labeled as made with real fruit, but they barely have any fruit in them. Parents, thinking they're buying something healthy for their kids, end up getting a bunch of sugar with a tiny bit of fruit. For instance, Welch's fruit snacks prominently display the word fruit on their packaging, but nearly half of what you're eating is pure sugar. The bottom line is, we need to get smarter about food labels. Companies are masters at using tricks to make their products look healthier than they actually are, and it's up to us to spot these lies. If 82% of Americans feel lied to by food labels, maybe it's time we start questioning what's really in our food. But why is the government not questioning the food industries on our behalf? Well, it should. But instead, corporate lobbying plays a big role in why the government has failed to regulate this. The food industry, which has been using HFCS as a cheap substitute for sugar for years, wields enormous power in influencing government decisions. Because of this, policies often favor the interests of big corporations over the health of the public. On top of that, there's this whole revolving door phenomenon between the food industry and regulatory agencies. A lot of former high-ranking food executives end up working for agencies like the FDA or USDA, where they can make decisions that benefit their old companies. This creates a conflict of interest, making it harder to enforce proper oversight or regulations that could protect public health. There's also been an ongoing turf war between the sugar industry and the corn industry over HFCS. The Sugar Association has pushed for brands to cut HFCS out of their products, while the Corn Refiners Association has tried to convince everyone that it's no worse than regular sugar. These lobbying efforts have made it tough to implement policies that would limit added sugars, including HFCS, even though experts are calling for stricter rules. Some even compare the dangers of HFCS to alcohol and tobacco. If you want to avoid HFCS, the best way is to stick with whole, unprocessed foods. HFCS didn't just stay in the US, where it was first introduced. Over time, it made its way around the world. Multinational food companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi played a huge role in spreading HFCS globally. As they expanded into new markets, they brought HFCS-laden sodas and snacks with them. In places like Mexico, cane sugar in sodas was replaced with HFCS, dramatically increasing people's sugar intake. Even in countries like China, where sugary food wasn't traditionally part of the diet, HFCS snacks and drinks became widely available. As a result, rates of diabetes and obesity began to rise. HFCS has become a global issue, making its way into diets across the world, bringing along its well-documented health risks. How to avoid HFCS and reclaim your health. If you're wondering how to avoid HFCS and take back control of your health, it's actually pretty simple once you know what to look for. Read food labels carefully. Avoid anything that lists high-fructose corn syrup or similar corn-based sweeteners. Stick to whole foods like fresh vegetables, fruits, lean meats, and whole grains, which are naturally free of HFCS. If you need something sweet, try natural alternatives like honey, maple syrup, or stevia instead of sugary processed products. Be cautious about drinks. Most sodas and sweetened beverages are loaded with HFCS. Switch to water, herbal teas, or fresh juices instead. Choose organic or minimally processed products whenever possible. They're less likely to contain HFCS. Making small swaps like cutting out processed snacks and sugary drinks can significantly improve your health. Over time, these changes will reduce your risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic conditions linked to HFCS. As you've just seen, high-fructose corn syrup has been quietly wreaking havoc on our health for decades, and now the truth is finally out. Do you think it's time to ban HFCS from our food supply? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more eye-opening food revelations. Stay informed, stay healthy.